All right, howdy everyone. So I'm Eric. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about testing your service and figuring out if it's actually working the way you think it's working. And because it's close to Halloween, I thought I might start off with a scary story. So the details have been changed to protect the innocent, and the company that this happened at no longer exists. So please, keep that in mind. Not involving this story though. So an engineer went out and they were working on the user management module for the site, making a couple of changes. Nothing super complex, but obviously they did it right. They didn't YOLO it. They had a branch. They put their changes on the branch. They raised that branch for review. They had a senior engineer sign off on the change. There was automated testing that was done on the branch to make sure everything's fine. The branch was then pushed to a staging environment. The QA team reviewed the changes and everything's working great. And then it was pushed to production, and production was monitored. Are there any increased errors? No, everything's fine. So about a week later, I'm sitting down with the QA manager and we're kind of trying to figure out some totally unrelated problem. And we're sitting there and we're doing manual testing, always a good start. And we're sitting there, we're logging in and out real quick, and testing a particular cookie setting or something like that. And we log in, we log out, we log in, we log out, and then we're going fast. The QA manager types in the username and forgets to type in the password before hitting enter, and logs in. And there's a moment where we both look at each other and, did you just see what I just saw? Needless to say, we did not follow best software engineering best practices in order to get the change out the door in order to fix that bug. After the fact, we asked the question, what's going on, right? Like, what happened here? We did everything right. And it turns out that it was a complex interaction of one engineer's change interacting with another engineer's feature flag and another engineer's slow rollout of something behind the scenes in the data store. And basically it was something where, again, blameless postmortems. This one was really blameless because no one person actually caused the defect. It just kind of came out due to subtle logic differences. So what I want to talk about today is one of the ways I've seen a testing pattern that I've seen happen in production now that might be able to start to catch more of these issues. I'm going to talk about what I mean, and then why I think it's actually useful, and some tips for how you can do it, and then some things to watch out for. First, though, when we talk about testing, again, a hopefully somewhat quick refresher. In the Maslow's hierarchy of testing, if you will, you have unit testing. This is the testing that hopefully you're doing the most frequently, right? That's the test that's sitting there, it's running, hopefully inspecting just a little bit of that function that you're working on. You probably have a lot of unit tests because hopefully you have a lot of business logic. Then beyond that, you've got something like integration testing, right? Where you've got now you've got maybe functions calling each other, or if you're really modern development, you've got microservices calling each other, but you're still stubbing and mocking out a lot of things because you're not really putting the whole system under test. Then you've got the idea of functional testing, where, okay, now we've got the whole service, it's up and running, but maybe it's running in a staging environment, or maybe it's using dummy databases, but now I'm sitting there maybe using Selenium, or some other synthetic end user agent to test the whole service. Well, I think there's something else that I've seen a lot of organizations start to do, and it's a sort of production functional testing. And I've been looking to see if anybody's calling it the same thing, and I don't see, yay, we found yet another term that we don't all agree on yet as an industry. And then finally, obviously, you have ad hoc testing, and hopefully you aren't doing very much of this. But this is also not to scale and not to proportion, but also kind of a good way to think about the amount of each kind of test you should have. Google's got a blog, something on this about 70, 20, 10 in terms of unit, integration, and functional. And so that's probably a good thing to kind of keep in mind about how much we're talking about here, that 10% or whatever of that production testing. It's not a lot, but it can really save your bacon. And again, specifically what I'm talking about here is production functional testing. So the idea of sitting there with an end user agent and actually interrogating your production service, not sitting there and staging, not QA, is your production service doing what you think it's doing? this is kind of, there's tools that do parts of this, right? The idea of you've got New Relic and you've got Dynatrace, and those are sorts of synthetic user agents, but they're really over all the way on the monitoring side of the world. And they're designed around the idea of, well, I'm going to log into the web user interface, and I'm going to create a transaction, and I'm going to put in my 4 or 5 business critical paths, and then I'm never going to touch this thing again. But in the other part of the world, you've got things like Jenkins and Travis, automated tests running that are controlled by code, right? Where you check in the code and you sit there and that code is basically owned by the team that's making the change, not the QA team that is the only ones that have logins to Dynatrace or Keynote. And so there is something in this middle part here where it's kind of this sweet spot, right, of can we have code that's also running in production and testing our production world? And, you know, the first question is, why bother with this? Really, do we need one more thing we have to do in order to be, you know, cool and hip? Is this one more test that we have to worry about breaking? And the answer is, there are some good parts that you get from this, right? First and foremost is, obviously, you catch regressions. This is the best slide I could come up with for regression. Regression to the meat. So it helps you catch both when you have regressions and also when you have silent failures. You have a long tail of most likely, you have a long tail of code being exercised in your production application, right? Where, yes, everybody's logging in all the time, but maybe there's something that, oh, it's the end user, it's the account modification of changing their username, things like that. And so you can start to dip into that long tail and catch problems that wouldn't necessarily be caught by production monitoring. Oh, hey, here, you know, order volume's down 20%, or by your other testing. And this kind of production testing works really well regardless of your architecture. Maybe you have a monolith, maybe you have an SOA, maybe you have microservices, maybe you have no services, maybe you're just sitting there answering HTTP calls by hand artisanally. It doesn't matter because this works with all of them because it's external, right? It's from the perspective of an end user. And it becomes a shared resource. So this becomes really helpful, especially when you have more than one team working on a piece of software or a service. Now all of a sudden you can have multiple teams start to agree with each other about, hey, I'm going to be making this change over here, and I know you own this other service over there. If this change here screws up that service, you'll let me know, right? Well, this becomes a shared resource that both teams can agree to and can say, oh, okay, cool, go make your changes, and when this test breaks, we'll all hear about it. And you know, that becomes a sort of a checks and balances, right? Where again, different teams are going to have different priorities. If you've got a mobile client team that wants to add a new extension to an API endpoint, but that would cause a breaking change for your web user interface or something like that. Now, again, you basically can have teams keep each other honest and also help each other out in terms of, oh, I didn't realize that change I pushed totally broke your other part of the site. So here's a kind of example for my employer. So we have 4 different teams that talk about our incidents, that touch our incidents pipeline. And these 4 teams are moving on completely different projects, right? Some of them are working on event ingestion, some of them are working on additional metadata collection, and they all have to play on the same event stream. They can't not work on the same set of services. But obviously, 20, 30, 40 people all trying to coordinate and know what each other's changes are doesn't work really well. So we have the idea of, in our testing structure, our production testing infrastructure, we have the idea of rings. And so these rings are basically, you know, hey, we're going to have the most common functionality, we're going to test that like every 30 seconds in production. Then less common functionality, we're going to test it every however many minutes, all the way up to, I think, like we have ring 4 or something like that, which is things that happen in events that happen once a day in production. And the other parts of the interesting thing here is when the tests, the number of tests passed for expected for, when different teams started contributing to each other's production functional test suites, oh, I'm going to add another test, and the alarm system would go off because it wasn't the right number of tests. Most testing systems are like, oh, I expect 20 and I got 21. Well, that's a problem. We actually made it so that you can add more tests without setting the alarms off, but if you don't add enough or if not enough pass, then the alarms start to scream. All of these put together kind of make an interesting sort of thing, right? Where basically it acts as a buffer to Conway's Law. Everybody talks about shipping their org chart and how, this is how our team ships software and abuses our users. And this kind of ends as a way, acts as, at least, it's not a perfect solution, but it's a buffer to prevent your end users from having to suffer from your own chosen internal development practices or dysfunctions, as the case may be. So, obviously, there are a few pitfalls here, a few things and gotchas to be aware of. First off, when you're starting to set up a production functional test suite, the very first question is, well, what are we going to test for? And you've kind of got, there's two camps that I've seen kind of have this argument go down. On the one camp, it's, well, let's take all of our production logs and let's distill them down into real user scenarios. And this kind of comes from the Keynote and Dynatraces and Gomez's of the world, where it's like, we're trying to simulate what we think real users are doing. Distilling down production logs, you're still kind of at the mercy of whatever those logs are going to give you, which may not be what you actually find is the most important thing to do for the business. And from the other perspective, it's, okay, well, let's have business scenarios, right? Okay, let's just have the product managers write the spec, and that'll have no problems at all. Again, it's a comfortable balance between the two with, again, engineering kind of moderating both halves is what I've seen work best. Flaky tests are still a thing. This is, again, hopefully you're just using something like RSpec or a Java testing framework, and you're just, it can be as simple to start out as putting RSpec on a host outside of your production network and running the tests every so often. But you still have the same pitfalls that you have with a lot of other testing infrastructure. If your tests are flaky, they're actually worse than if you don't have them. You want to make sure that you have confidence that when that test says, cries wolf, that you actually need to go investigate it, as well as the other test hygiene you have. And the kind of counterpart to having a buffer to Conway's Law is that when these tests fail, and like those rings that I was showing you a little bit ago, you're going to have to triage it. Because now you've got this test that's failed, and nobody knows. There's probably at least a decent idea of what broke and what the change was, but if you don't have really great visibility into your change of your environment, sometimes it's code, sometimes it's infrastructure, sometimes it's an external third party. If you don't have that visibility into what's changed in your environment, you are going to have to kind of struggle to understand basically who owns this and, okay, who's going to actually go make this test not fail anymore. So I think I'm ending a little bit early here, but to recap, consider doing functional testing in your production environment. It can buffer your users from Conway's Law. It's really valuable in order to get that visibility and understand, is your production environment doing what you think it's doing? It can speed up your developers, and it can speed up your developers, again, by enabling each team or each group of people to work on their own functionality with the confidence that even if they break something, they'll find out pretty quickly. Moderation in all things. Don't kind of go to one extreme or another of putting in tons and tons of testing, or you want to have fewer of those functional tests, if we remember the pyramid right. You want to be aware of all the usual failure testing modes and make sure that when you do this, that all of the teams that are going to get told, hey, you just broke production in this subtle way, that they all agree, yeah, okay, we'll go fix that, because it's kind of important. And again, this is just kind of a reminder in general. The more complicated you make the plumbing, the easier it is to stuff up the drain. Start simple. Like I said, RSpec and sitting on an external host with a Git repo that you just check out. It's a great way to start. Other than that, thank you very much. Questions?
Yeah, awesome talk.
Thank you.
So, judging by the name, right, production functional testing happens in
and
production.
Name is, like I said.
Yeah, right. So, assuming it happens actually in production, right, what do you do with production functional testing around perhaps data that you can't reuse or modify in production because it's production, right?
So you're still going to be doing some form of synthetic creation, right? Well, okay. Most likely, you're going to go down the path of not wanting to modify somebody else's account. So you're probably going to start with the idea of, I'm going to create my own account, again, with the idea of a website, maybe it's an e-commerce site. I'm going to create an account, I'm going to add things to the cart, and then I'm going to look and see, did I actually get what I think I got in that cart? So you will have to have kind of a setup phase in most of your productional functional testing. Again, the places I've seen do this pretty quickly go, okay, cool, we're now going to make a DSL because we really don't want to ever have to think about the basics of setups of an account, right? It's like with account assumed, go.
Thanks, Eric. Great talk. Question, you mentioned the count of, expected tests and past tests. And so, of course, #OpsLife, I'm immediately thinking, so somebody adds another test you didn't expect, and then a test you really cared about starts failing, but you don't notice because there's the right count of passing tests. How would you recommend solving that?
So there's kind of, I don't have a perfect solution for you. The answer is that eventually those counts should be consistent, right? That only for a small period of time. So the way that that particular system works is it is its own check and balance. There's two parts. There's the test suite, and then there's the config that watches it, because the test suite really is just testing. And then there's the monitoring tool that's basically sitting there emitting those metrics, and that monitoring tool has that config. So what usually happens is the tests land in the suite, and then, okay, cool, everything's working. Now I'm going to update the config in the monitoring tool. Like they're both assumed to be part of that process of adding a test, just at different points in time.
So I assume the functional testing in production is for when things are working properly. I read about failure Fridays at PagerDuty.
Yep.
And I was hoping you could talk briefly about those tests, how they're related.
So they're not, that kind of testing happens all the time, and so Failure Fridays are basically a point in time, 1 hour a week, where we inject faults into the system behind the scenes to make sure that the logic we assume about failures is actually true. Those tests occasionally go off, but they're basically another external point of view for did we pass or fail our Failure Friday, right? And they're actually really nice. One of the really nice things about this is we run this test so often, for us anyways, it makes a lot of sense to do so, and with those rings, that 1 in a million events start to actually become pretty repeatable. Because, oh, well, that TP99 or that 99th percentile request that you never catch but that one poor user catches, well, now you might catch like that 1% or 2%. You might catch those, which is kind of nice.
So you mentioned that the ownership model needs to be really clear, right? Which makes sense, right?
Yep.
Do you have like a best practice or a practice that you follow around establishing who owns a test that like cross-cuts a couple different modules, or who owns the monitors associated with those tests?
So the different teams own the overall responsibility for when the alarm goes off. It's your response. When that alarm goes off, you get to check it first. So the event ingestion team takes care of it for the incidents pipeline, or maybe it's a different team. But one team owns the responsibility to answer the call. That team, however, has the authority to look at it and go, nope, not us, and hand it off as basically high priority to another team. And every team has agreed together, okay, when we get one of these, we'll drop everything and fix it, because it's important, it's production.
Given the nature of these tests, do you then take those same tests once you find a failure and then move them down in the cycle for a lower level regression so that you don't see those again? How does that process work to bring those down, and how do you create one of those that wasn't already thought of or tested in the lower environments?
So yeah, there's two different paths there going, one's going up, one's coming down. When these tests fail, again, hopefully there's very few of them, so when they fail, you should hopefully have a lot of other things that are associated with that failure, other pull requests, other work being done in your teams, and so part of that work becomes making sure that that test failure is taken care of. So that's kind of the way it gets pulled down. The way it gets pulled up, though, is, again, the engineers, when they create a new feature, they'll ask the question as part of that feature launch, does this feature fit into our smaller framework for functional testing? Is it going to be used by 1% of our customers or 100% of our customers? And do we have coverage? And these tests can be run in staging and QA environments as well, which gives, again, the developers can basically say, hey, I'm about to push this to production, am I about to get yelled at? Just as kind of that last sanity check. So.
Testing you do when the release is happening, or is it something you do every day?
So I've seen it two different ways. At my current employer, it's happening all the time, 30 minutes, 1 minute, 5 minutes. I've also seen it happen at a previous employer right after the production push. Now, they kind of lived under the world that their infrastructure, it was a little different. Their infrastructure didn't change as often. So they kind of lived with the idea of once it's in production, we're going to test it once. But it's kind of like, at that point, it was more automated QA on production. So it depends on your needs.
So you had mentioned this is kind of a buffer to Conway's Law.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if there's any concerns about the efficiency or on turnaround of features, whereas it's hard enough to get developers to write tests, or there's some time spent there. Now you have to kind of reach out to other teams and figure out, who owns what.
Well, again, it's a shared resource, so anybody, at least, again, the ways I've seen it done, it's a shared resource. And so that means that everybody feels comfortable putting new tests in. That was part of the question of, hey, I'm going to add things in. That comes with the the dual trade-off of, when I add this test, am I going to be the one fixing its problem? So there is a little bit of the caution, as well as, if I don't add this test, am I going to get that email a week from now saying that someone was able to log in without a password? So it is kind of self-policing. But you do have to have a good testing culture. So that's kind of the first thing, is make sure that your culture is amenable to automated testing. The one good thing about if you're doing it in the repeated cycle and not just right after production push, is it's one less thing you have to wait for a QA team or somebody else. It's one less blocker, which is kind of nice.
Would something like Gomez fit in that space for the synthetic tool? Because we've seen that in my previous company. We used that a lot with an e-commerce site to run through the entire work cycle for logging in, shopping, checking out, and they built in various Gomez products which are hidden from the public, but were there designated for the tool to use, because then the ordering management system knows to kill that order immediately. But is that sort of is that something that you'd use, or what do you use?
So two different parts here, because you reminded me of something else. Gentleman asked about data setup. So this is like what Gomez and Dynatrace and App Dynamics do to some degree with the synthetic transactions, but it's just code. You can literally just use this with your existing HTTP-based testing framework if you have one. If you have an API client for your application, you can basically just sit there and say, hey, I'm going to make API calls to my application. Do I get the correct response? So it doesn't have to go all the way to a GUI-based third-party product. You can literally just sit there with a test repo. Part of that, though, that you talked about with the calls to the inside of the application also goes to setup. Again, what I've seen when I've seen organizations talk about this, like I think Uber does this to some degree with synthetic rides and other e-commerce sites, there is a point in time where you might have to modify data behind the scenes, and so that's kind of that. If you're going to have that logic in your tests, you want to be very careful to call it out, that basically this logic here is doing something that is not what we worry about our end users doing. Deleting a user, if that's a concern for you, if we can't have 1 million users in the database, then you might have to have some setup logic that takes care of that.
What's your view on other type of testing in production? So, for example, performance testing or SLA testing in highly distributed systems?
Okay, so in general, I'm a fan of more testing, but I kind of work for an organization where we want to make sure everything works. So this can also tie into some of that, right? Because some of these things you can use as baseline, right? Depending upon how you do this and where you're running your external test from, you might be able to say, this is the baseline for this. The request should be no taller than this to ride. That you should have no more than 200 milliseconds to answer this. The rings thing, the metrics I showed you, we say that because if you think about it, if you're making API calls and you're making a whole bunch of them, your test suite may take longer to respond. So we do have an outer bound on that time frame. So that they can tie in there. When you get to the point that you're now saying, we could production performance test from 100 places around the world, that's where you're starting to run into app dynamics territory and this idea of pay somebody else to have the endpoints on adverse enough networks that you get interesting behavior, transit behavior.
Do you test the tests before you put them into production?
Like it was, well, okay. Again, I've seen it both ways. I should actually say that. Yeah, I have seen it both ways. The one place that does the test right after production usually didn't run them in staging. But for my current employer, yeah, we test them beforehand because, and again, that goes to principle of least surprise. You don't want this to be YOLO. Exactly. You don't want this to be the first time that you find out you've got a bug. You want this to be oh, there's this little subtle logic thing or something else changed I don't know about, not the first line of defense.
I have one more, which is whenever you talk to some segments of your organization about testing in production, they immediately get nervous and they either start talking about observer effects or what it's going to do to the metrics or just, general FUD. Like, can you give us an overall, how do you combat or approach that so that somebody could make the case to do this?
Let's see here. So, again, the very modern approach is that you want more data, not less. And so that's where I'd probably start a discussion like that, is to say, this is happening. Our production infrastructure is having these answers one way or another. So why don't we go get them before we expose our customers to them? And again, that's because you are wanting it to be something that catches the problem, hopefully before a real user sees it. There are other things you can do. Hopefully you can say, and again, you can start small with just a real simple set of API calls and build it over time, but you can also go out and say, hey, this is a great way for us to start tagging our testing accounts. Because some infrastructure, basically, you can go out and say, I'm going to create accounts with a certain prefix, and they won't be counted in our user metrics or the marketing funnel is always the favorite one of, because again, marketing teams will have their own set of tests in their, or monitoring in production that you don't know. It's like shadow monitoring no one knows about. But you can start to say, hey, we'll make sure that we always create these with prefixes or some sort of flag. So, cool.
Any more questions? Okay, well, thank you, Eric.